All right, so like she said, my name is Kantrowitz, and I'm here to talk about open source sustainability. So let's start at the very beginning. What do I mean by open source? So some people have very specific opinions about what constitutes open source, but I'm going to take a more general stance of things that look and feel like open source, things where there is code and it is out and open in the world. I'm also not going to wade into the open source versus free software debate. So let's look at a couple of examples of things that I mean when I say open source. So the majority of projects, just by the numbers on GitHub, is one person writing some code to do a thing and then putting it up on GitHub because, why not? This is how I got my start in open source many, many years ago. I was writing plugins for the Track ticket management system. If you still use any of those, I'm very sorry. But some more visible projects are the really, really big ones. Projects so vast and omnipresent that it's easy to think of them as just part of the fabric of the universe. And then sometimes those projects get even bigger and decide to sort of create a dedicated legal entity for themselves to exist under, usually as a partnership between multiple companies. A newer venue for a lot of open source stuff are VC-backed startups putting stuff out into the world, where the company acts as a steward for the open source project and is still sort of selling things on the side, selling support contracts, and what have you. What I call mirage projects are an offshoot of that sort of feels like the fabric of the universe thing back on the big project side, except unlike those bigger projects like the Linux kernel where it's actually a lot of people, most of these are frighteningly small. This was brought to the forefront by the Heartbleed vulnerability in OpenSSL, where we woke up one day and realized, oh wow, there's like somewhere between 2 and 4, depending exactly how we count them, maintainers of the world's TLS infrastructure. Some older projects, especially big Linux distros, tend to feel a bit stuffy compared to smaller, more nimble GitHub generation projects, but they also have a lot of institutional memory and structural history. So these kinds of projects have been around for a very long time, even as individual developers come and go. Some open source projects are things that may not be specifically software, but I call them moonshots. They're big, crazy ideas. So let's make TLS free for everyone forever, or beware, let's make Python applications work on everything. These usually encompass source code, but also more broadly coming up with standards, coming up with tools, coming up with sort of the structures behind the project. And because, again, we're taking a very wide view, there's things that aren't source code at all. So Stack Overflow or Wikipedia, they have code behind them, but the content on them is effectively acting like an open source project. The legal specifics differ a little bit here and there, but the overall idea is open source. And clearly this is not a complete list of every project or type of project that exists in the world, but it's an idea of what I mean when I say open source. I'm talking about everything that you could possibly consider to be open source. Cool? All right, so that's 2 words from my title, open source sustainability. What about that third word? Literally speaking, sustainability is ensuring that a project that exists today will continue to exist tomorrow, and then the tomorrow after that, and so on. Money and time are important factors, and don't worry, we will get to those soon. But the fundamental limiting factor on most open source projects is the rate of burnout of contributors and maintainers. Most projects fail not because of technology problems, but because people just don't want to work on them anymore. Most common symptoms of burnout in open source are these 3. The cycle of feeling guilty about letting down your users, dread about working on the project, and then bitterness towards the project itself, or sometimes even the users of the project. So why do I care about this at all? Open source has truly taken over the world. In almost every facet of technology, communal resources have pushed us faster and farther than we ever could individually. If we want this pace of progress to continue, then we need to continue to use and exploit these shared resources. But with this cross-pollination comes interdependence. While open licensing helps to ensure that there's the possibility of someone picking up a fallow project, it doesn't really help if there's no one there to pick up the banner when the last maintainer leaves. And if I can digress for a little bit on why I think open source itself is important, it's because I think that we can build things better together than we ever can individually. A lot of these problems in software, the value to the market is too small or too hard to find for any one corporate or company entity to build a solution to it. But collectively, we can all do it together and we all benefit for it. So if open source rules the world, and clearly I think that's great, or I wouldn't be up here giving this talk, what happened? How do we end up with a worldwide software ecosystem built on the backs of a relatively tiny number of volunteers? As a globally simplistic answer, infrastructure investment has been lagging across the board everywhere. Putting time and money into things like bridges and dams rarely shows returns immediately, if at all. If your focus is only on the earnings for the next quarter, it's real easy to just let these things slip one quarter to the next, to the next, to the next. It's not really on purpose, it just kind of happens. But a deeper structural answer, and the origin of the title of the talk, it lies in how we make things. I can only put my brain towards making one thing at a time. But while I'm doing that, I'm almost certainly going to be using hundreds of other open source projects and tools. Even in the best scenario, there are always going to be more users than contributors, and that imbalance has spiraled far out of control. So for example, a really simple Ruby on Rails web app, you probably can't even read all the tiny bubbles, and it doesn't really matter. The idea is that even a tiny Rails web app sits on top of a mountain of complexity of other open source projects, libraries, and abstractions. As we build better and better abstractions, it becomes easy to forget the shoulders of the giants on which we stand. So why all the interest in sustainability lately? Way back when open source was basically just some crazy college students in like Massachusetts and California, basically everyone that used open source also worked on open source. Maybe I worked on GCC and you worked on Bash, but we both used each other's tools, and so we both benefited relatively equally. But over time, this balance eroded. More and more people pull value out of the system that are putting it back in. As the third-ish wave of open source developers is reaching middle age and deciding that maybe other pursuits are more important, a lot of them are having families or trying to get into new hobbies or becoming more sort of management-oriented in their jobs and wanting to get away from writing software and managing software. Very often, there just aren't new, fresh faces willing to take up that software banner, and so here we are. It's really hard to pick a patient zero, but it was probably either the LAMP stack, meaning PHP, MySQL, and Apache, or Ruby on Rails, depending on how you measure it, that really got the ball rolling on the corporate use of open source. Maybe Perl CGI, depending on who you ask. But VC-funded startups back in like the early 90s realized that they could switch to free as in beer tools and save some money, and that was great because they didn't have very much money. VCs hadn't really learned about this one cool trick yet, so the VCs were still giving them the amount of money it would take to go and buy commercial software stacks, but they could just turn around and use that. If I'm being cynical, they could use it to pocket the difference, or if I'm being nice, they could double down, build better projects, et cetera, et cetera. They were still trying to figure out how this whole web thing was going to work back then. But all good bubbles must come to an end, and certainly by now, startups and big companies alike know that zero-cost software stacks exist and are relatively high quality overall. And budgets and VC fundings and whatnot have all accounted for this at this point. So for many young startups, using a free as in beer software stack is no longer just a technical choice. Very often they can't afford anything else. At the end of the day, open source and capitalism are at loggerheads. Capitalism requires, or at least certainly encourages, privatization, and open source is the opposite of that. As long as the bulk of companies continue to draw more value from the commons than they put back in, we're always going to have a sustainability problem. And to mention briefly, a lot of the interaction between capitalism and open source is in the form of intellectual property, but I did a whole talk on that last year, so if you want more info on how IP shapes open source, go to that link. But all right, so if that's the general answer to what went wrong with sustainability and open source, let's look at some specific projects that were ultimately unsustainable in one way or another. Two that are very close to my heart are React and RethinkDB, two database projects / startups. Both of these were originally VC-backed startups, but they were built as open source projects from the beginning. One of the founders of RethinkDB has a fantastic postmortem on what went wrong with RethinkDB that I think should be mandatory, certainly for all open source maintainers and probably all open source users. But very roughly, the database market is incredibly saturated, both in terms of money and mind share. Whatever your feelings on things like MySQL and Postgres are, they've certainly set a very high standard for what exists that is free as in beer and free as in speech. A big player in the open source world for Android is Cyanogen and what used to be their open source distribution, Cyanogen Mod. In 2016, after a big management shakeup, management took a look at their books and decided that it just wasn't worth the money to keep Cyanogen Mod open. It was costing them in terms of having to deal with user support and money in terms of people that would have been willing to pay for Cyanogen if it wasn't free. Two notable individual cases are Why the Lucky Stiff from the Ruby world and Mark Pilgrim from the Python world. This is not a call out or a critique of either of those, but a cautionary tale of what happens if you just escalate and escalate the burden of an entire community onto individual people. This rarely works out well for either side. One particularly weird example of a sustainability oops was ZFS. It was originally developed at Sun. It's an advanced storage / file system project. Later on, people wanted to get ZFS working on Linux. And the ZFS authors were very clearly in favor of this, but unfortunately, there have been continual legal snafus about this such that no one can actually work on it, we think, maybe, question mark. And finally, one more sort of general wrong turn, this one hits a lot of different projects, is the idea of drive-by contributors. These are people that show up with a patch, get the patch in, are very friendly, but then they take off. You solved their problem, and they're not going to stick around in your community. On one hand, drive-by contributors are often bringing absolutely crucial bug fixes or new features, things to inject new life into your project. But on the other hand, getting someone mentored through those initial stages of getting your first patch into a project takes a lot of time and energy. There's no good answer here. Just be aware that while you should definitely be in a position to accept drive-by contributions, you as an individual, keep in mind when you are approaching burnout, and don't be afraid to step back and say, I don't have the emotional capability to mentor people anymore, and if your project can't accept new contributions from first-time contributors for a little while, just be understanding and figure out where to go from there. All right, so if those are things that detract from sustainability, how about things to improve it? A big part of any project is how it's run, and that can have a similarly large impact on sustainability. So let's talk about governance models of projects real quickly. A benevolent dictator for life is where most projects start. Projects created by one person, and then even as more contributors and maintainers join the project, that one person remains in control of the overall direction. This can work really well for a young project, but over time, as the project grows and grows, you have to run all decisions through this one person, and it can become a bottleneck that leads to frustration, that leads to burnout, that leads to poor sustainability. So usually projects that start out as a BDFL will slowly fragment into a city-states model, for lack of a better term. So these are usually multiple BDFL-like people managing either different sections of the code base, or just sort of, in the case of Linux, they just operate completely independently and swap patches back and forth, although that's definitely a weird one. And then if they get even bigger, they'll usually switch to a more formal hierarchy structure. So for instance, the Apache Foundation has a formal hierarchy of maintainers for different projects. This can be very useful for new maintainers because they can look up on basically an org chart when they have to figure out who to talk to, but it can get frustrating because people deal with this at work and they don't really want to deal with it at home. So useful, but make sure that people know when they can avoid this. Newer projects have started to switch a little bit more towards this council approach, where you've got multiple technical committees or councils that are responsible for different things. So they're less of a hierarchy and more of a federated group of committees. And sometimes, if the contributor base is extremely stable over time, you can just forego most of these rules and operate on rough consensus. And lots more models. Again, I can't possibly list all of them, and I really wouldn't even want to try. As with most things, all of these are a continuum. You're going to want to, for any individual project, try and pull the best from a bunch of these different ideas to figure out what works best for your project. Conway's law states that the output of any team is going to eventually look like the org chart of that team. This is intended to be a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's still remarkably accurate. The choice of leadership and decision-making structures will affect not just the humans, but the software those humans produce. And as a final thing about governance models, unfortunately it can be a little bit hard sometimes to figure out exactly which direction you need to move in order to improve sustainability. For some projects, moving to more structure will help to sort of relieve overburdened maintainers. It'll give them a little bit more support to fall back on. But in other projects, increasing bureaucracy and paperwork will push an already mostly burned out maintainer into full-on I'm leaving mode. When you're playing with governance and management structures, always make sure that you're listening to the people that you are governing or managing, and switch gears if you got it wrong the first time. But okay, really, in the end, open source projects and maintaining open source projects are all about time, and time is money. The simplest funding model is to just not have one, be a volunteer project. And these are great. Some people enjoy coding for its own sake, some people want to build up their professional portfolio, or some people really just want to fix one particular problem they're having with a piece of software. But always remember that volunteering is an act of altruism. I speak from personal experience. It is very, very easy to end up in that cycle of guilt and bitterness that I mentioned before until you just never want to see another computer again. One step up from that is working on open source during your normal work hours. This might be a project that belongs to your company that you're improving, or you're contributing a patch back to a piece of software that your company uses. And this is a great option when you can find it. Unfortunately, a lot of companies are not cool with this. They don't really see why they should give somebody money in order to give away a product for free. So now we enter the realm of projects that are trying to be self-sustaining, meaning that a project is trying to bring in enough income to support at least some of the time that is spent on it. By far the most popular method of doing this is to sell support contracts. This can be really hit or miss, though. The usual problem is that small companies that are using your project won't have enough money to buy a support contract, and big companies that are using your project probably will just say, we'll just do it internally, it's fine. So usually after that, people will go to open core and selling premium add-ons of some kind. Usually this will be in the form of either the freemium model, where you're giving away the core and adding on extra features, or dual licensing, where the entire thing is available under either a very liberal copyleft license, or if you give them money, a very permissive commercial license. The big problem is that in either case, you have to figure out something that people are going to pay for, and this can be difficult. And so we reach the option that most people go with. If you like this, how about sending me a few bucks on PayPal? This is so common, I want to dive into a couple of specifics on this one. The simple solution, straight up tip jar. This is really easy to set up. There's tools like PayPal if you really want to get into them. And it can be really heartening to just every now and then you get sent $10 from a random stranger. But if you're not already okay with working for free, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be getting a even close to living wage from this. And as a maintainer, I would almost always much rather a nice thank you email than getting $5 from one random person. Slightly more stable solution is some kind of recurring donation. These allow you to plan out how much income you're going to get per month. So this is how much time I can spend on the project that's paid per month, et cetera. Patreon currently mostly owns this market, and it's really easy to get started with, but it hasn't really made a lot of inroads with the software world, so that can be a little bit hard. Both one-time and recurring donations, though, share a common problem. In a lot of cases, it ends up being friends all paying each other because they like each other, while the companies that are driving the economic benefit from our work do nothing. I can only speak for myself, but I really don't want any individuals that use anything I have ever written to feel like they owe me for my code. What I want, most of the time, is for the companies and places that are making money off of my projects to make sure that some of those resources get back to me in a fair way such that I can continue to improve those projects so they make more money, and so on. But some other donation options, I did actually personally run a Kickstarter to fund some work on open source, and it was successful, but it was extremely stressful, and I really don't recommend it for anyone. Kickstarter or any other crowdfunding website means that you need to promise a whole bunch of features. Basically, you're selling work before you've done it, and then you get one lump sum of money, and that's it. I really hope that you budgeted correctly and did all of your time estimates correctly, because we know that engineers are super great at budgets and time estimates. Some mid-sized projects looking to tempt donations from larger companies will tend to try to get nonprofit status, so those donations are tax deductible, and that's great. But creating a nonprofit from scratch is really hard, so usually they'll join existing umbrella groups that can accept a donation on their behalf and then disperse money as needed. I really want to highlight the work of the Software Freedom Conservancy on this, which has helped dozens of projects to set up this kind of umbrella nonprofit arrangement. If you're interested in doing this for one of your own projects, I really recommend talking to them. They've got a sign-up form on their website to get more information on doing this. But okay, enough about donations. Let's talk about other weirder things that are rarer in the funding model world. Selling ad space can be quite lucrative. Ad sales basically run the entire internet at this point. But at the scale most open source projects are talking about, they don't usually bring up very much revenue. And also you run the risk of having if you don't control your ad network, you run the risk of random ads promoting things that you really don't want promoted on your website showing up. And if you run your own ad network, then you have to deal with actually selling the ads, which is incredibly time consuming. More common in the academic world, but there are some places like Mozilla, Stripe, and the Python Software Foundation that do fund smaller projects via grants. So this means you write a grant proposal that I want to do X, it will require Y amount of money. They accept the grant, they give you the money. This does have the same problem as I mentioned with crowdfunding, where you need to budget and do your time estimates properly at the beginning, otherwise you can end up screwed, but it's something. Bug bounties are most common in the InfoSec world as a tool to try to incentivize people to not give away all of the exploits to the evil bad guys, but they do sometimes exist for things like standard project features. They're not common enough that you can probably get, again, anywhere close to a living wage, but maybe this will improve in the future. Worker co-ops are a really deep rabbit hole that I don't have time to go into up here, but we're seeing a couple of marginally successful so far worker-owned co-ops like Snowdrift and Tidelift. Time will tell if this ends up being a successful model for funding. And so now we look a little further out towards the future. With science, medicine, and the arts, there's many national level and international level organizations that provide funding for things like basic research. Basic research, the whole idea is that it doesn't really produce much of a commercial benefit now, but it'll form the basis of future work later. And that sounds a lot like open source. So maybe we should have a National Institute of Software too? And if I can dream really big, universal basic income, I'm sure some of you will be nodding already, and some of you will be very confused at what this is. Come talk to me later. But the general idea is just give people money and let them do whatever the hell they want, and hopefully some of these people will write software, and it'll be awesome. But I'm running out of time, so hopefully by now I've convinced you that sustainable software is important, and you've got at least a couple of ideas on how to make your projects more sustainable. But in the end, what do we do right now? So I've got three simple recommendations. First, be kind. As I've stressed before, the enemy of open source is most often burnout, not technical problems. Practice empathy both when making and using open source, and it can help a lot in improving sustainability. Second, be aware. If you make money using open source, which is hopefully almost every company, assuming that you're actually making money in general, be on the lookout for ways that you can help the projects that you depend on. And finally, be ready. Be ready for changes. Maybe you're depending on a library and the only maintainer of it has a kid and decides that they're just not going to do software anymore because they've got something more important in their life. Or maybe you're the maintainer of a really great command line tool, but you just wake up one morning and you decide, I don't really want to maintain this anymore. Or maybe all of software will change in some way that we haven't even predicted because we've only really been doing this for a couple of decades. We don't really know how to do it yet. Be ready for it. Things will change and it's okay. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Questions? We don't have a runaround mic, so I'll just repeat your question. Yes? So the question was, is there an ethical way to retire a project that does have some small user base, but not enough to sort of keep the project going? Or do I know any examples of that? Just be honest with people. Tell people that you want to work on other things, and they will hopefully be empathetic and empathic enough to understand that. Some people won't be because it's the internet, and the internet is bad at empathy, but that's the best thing you can try and do. You know, the code is going to be available, assuming that you've correctly licensed it, so that's also an important thing to do. Make sure that your licenses and copyrights are up to date, so that if anyone does want to fork it and keep it going, they will totally be able to. But beyond that, just tell people that you're ready to move on, and remember that you don't owe them anything. Any other questions?
Thank you for nice solve.
Glad it is very useful. He was thanking me for a piece of software that I wrote. All right, well, thank you very much, and I look forward to Connie Lynn's closing remarks.